computer science. It does relate to computer science, but how is it related?
Well, I haven't thought about it. They wouldn't have used Windows 7.
Well, but any operating system, can have, weaknesses, security holes and whatnot.
Yeah, but you would have used one that's not like popular with 95% of the world.
Exactly. Now, why is that the case? Why don't you want to use, an operating system that is also used by 95% of all the other computers in the world?
Because the hackers.
Because it's worthwhile for the hackers to attack it, right? Now, there is an operating system that are used in certain other nuclear plants. You guys can look this up. I won't explain it in detail. It's called QNX. QNX is the de facto standard of highly critical missions. They all use QNX as an operating system. But QNX as a company is now bought by another company. Can anyone guess who bought QNX?
Microsoft.
No, Microsoft has no desire to do that sort of thing. It turns out to be Blueberry. The company that makes cell phones for commercial use. They bought QNX. BlackBerry, sorry. Yeah, BlackBerry. Okay, well, you can see how long I've been staying under the rock. So BlackBerry bought QNX. I think they're planning something big. I think they're replacing either their operating system on the cell phones or they're moving into a new business. So we don't know exactly what they're planning to do with it.
Wasn't it an even bigger company that owns the BlackBerry franchise? Is that like Research in Motion or something like that? Yeah.
That's a big company.
Yeah. They own like everything.
Yeah. But QNX is an interesting operating system. It's Unix-like, but it is also extremely modular. Now, when we talk about modular, it means the kernel or the really crucial part of the operating system only has, I think, when I was studying, it was about 40,000 bytes. Okay, so it's a really, really small and tight kernel. The smaller the kernel, that means the exposure to flaws will be smaller. Okay, fewer lines of code, easier to debug and easier to verify. So QNX was built from the ground up as a very, very modular type of operating system. You can replace, a driver. You can replace, almost any component with QNX without having to reboot the computer. You just disable that particular module, replace it, and start it up again, and it will be fine. By comparison, Linux is very monolithic. In other words, Linux has a huge kernel that shares, the same security layer, which means natively it is not as secure as QNX. Yep.
Well, Linux is just supposed to be like really customizable and fancy. That's what all Linux really is.
It is. It's the Honda of operating systems, which basically means it is very open. It's easily accessible.
Third party. It's third party. That's
Third party to.
everything else.
Well, since it's open source, there's no party. I mean, it really is just open, except for the core group of Linux. They still maintain and they control the version control or revision control, so they can determine what changes should be brought into the kernel and what changes should kind of stay as experimental and so on and so forth. But yes, when you install Linux, you can also install the full source code of Linux. If you're good at that sort of programming, you can tweak Linux any way you want. And you can redistribute your special version, or you can keep it as your own. It's entirely your choice. So it's a cool concept. Yep.
Wasn't Gen 2 built kind of around that philosophy?
Gen 2 is one of the distributions of Linux. So the philosophy of Gen 2 is you don't download pre-compiled binaries. You only
for what hardware you have.
Yep. You only build it for the specific hardware that you have. But the problem with Gen 2 is, you have to recompile everything. So every time there's an update, especially, if you have an update of a library that everybody depends on, then you just trigger a huge amount of recompiling. It is not uncommon that some people have to recompile for days before the computer can be used again. So to me, that's not really a viable option. Okay, well, but that's interesting. But how do these people find flaws with operating systems? In other words, here's Windows XP, Windows 7, whatever operating system that a hacker wants to hack into. So the question is, how do they find these security flaws? Now with sorry, go ahead.
Don't they hire hackers?
Yeah, but how do the hackers do the job? That's the question, because that part is computer science. Okay, that part is computer science. Now, with open source, with Linux and stuff like that, you can say, oh, they have full access to the source code. They can analyze the source code and see if they can find, the spots that are particularly weak in terms of security and try to hack it through there. But Windows is not open source. It's completely is a black box. So how do you know, where are the weak spots of a black box?
We know what ports are open.
You know which ports are open, but then most programs can just ignore improperly formatted packets and stuff like that. Sorry, buffer overflow, but that doesn't work anymore because of the execution inhibition bit of modern processors. So becoming a hacker means, and also becoming someone who would counter these hackers means that you definitely need to understand a lot about computer science, and probably more than just becoming a programmer, because you're looking into a black box and you're saying, now what are the security flaws of this black box? In other words, you have to think of ways to get into the system other than the ways that you're supposed to use. So that's an interesting topic. I'm glad that you brought it up, because it is computer science, but it is one of those things that most 4-year universities would not even talk about. I don't understand why. I think it has to do with not enough professors have exposure, and 2, it is not quote unquote academic enough to talk about at universities. And possibly a third reason, the professors don't want to get into trouble when other people say, oh, you're teaching your students to become hackers. But you know what? Hackers will be there anyway. If we don't train our own hackers, then that means that we won't have any defense against hacking either.
And with this one, I heard on the radio, I didn't read anything, I just heard, and they were saying that I guess there is a research institution somewhere that I guess is in the process of almost publishing a paper that relates somehow to what they think may be the solution to this, and they were saying they're hoping that once it gets released into the academic community, more people will start researching that to try and fix it. It was interesting.
It is very interesting.
Yeah.
Because the United States is actually moving closer and closer to what we call the smart grid. Has anyone heard of the smart grid? A smart grid is basically a computer-managed power grid system. And that's big, okay? We are not talking about one nuclear plant. We're talking about the entire power grid of the United States, okay? Now, when you think about it, okay, conventionally, you would think, blowing up, jet airplanes, passenger airplanes is big. And people don't really think about the power grid much, because it doesn't have fireballs. Okay, you don't have hundreds and thousands of people getting killed instantly. But if you think about it from the infrastructure perspective, disrupting the power grid can do more damage than 2 airplanes that are crashing into the Trade Center. If you think about the money and infrastructure perspective, power grid is a big deal. Okay, now once they turn it into a smart power grid, which means they're managed by computers, if those computers are exposed to the network, that's a lot of exposure, okay? That is a lot of exposure. Hurting the infrastructure and logistics hurts a lot more than technical stuff. So that's something that you guys can keep an eye on, is the smart grid thing, and whether it is still on its way to what they are planning in the past. Interestingly, how many countries do you think use Windows? A lot, right? What about China? I mean, I'm pretty sure you guys have heard about Microsoft complaining that China has has rampant copyright violations. They just make free copies of Windows XP, Windows 7, and so on and so forth. What about the government? The government of China actually has switched to its own operating system since 2001, or there's a big push to switch from Windows to their own operating system, which is based on BSD. BSD is one of the main distributions of Linux, but they have done some modifications also to that operating system. Now, how many people in the United States are trained to hack BSD, which is already a very stable and a very secure operating system to start with? Very few. Okay, so they have been doing this, since 2001. Yep.
What operating system does the U.S. mainly use?
Sorry?
The U.S. government?
Windows.
Really?
Yep. Yep. Now that actually has there are many reasons why that is the case. One, it is there, it is available, most people know how to use it. But there are also VARs out there, value-added resellers. These are the people that usually have contracts with, the state government or the federal government, and their job is to support Microsoft products, not just support as in after it is sold, but also to push new products and keep the government using Microsoft products.
Yeah, but I would think like the U.S. government with all their access to sophisticated, advancements in computer science, technology, whatever, that they would be able to hire somebody to create a whole new operating system that nobody could do.
The problem is money. Money talks. Okay, people who have to lose companies, corporations, and people who will lose money because of the switch to anything else would use lobbying to stop any type of switch to another operating system. Any mentioning of open source software usually would get shut down like right away. People just say that's not secure, that's not mature, this is not the way things should be done. Yep. So that culture will change, but how quickly will it change? That's the question. And if they can get into a nuclear plant in Iran that's running Windows 7, do you think they can get into other computers running Windows 7?
Yeah.
Sure. And how many machines do we have running Windows 7? A lot. Okay. So I would say my comment is, thankful it is not happening to us. It's somebody else getting the hit. I don't think it's the United States launching the virus attack. I think the possibility of that happening is like zero. Iran has other not so friendly neighbors, let's just say, that are also highly sophisticated. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I visited the Middle East like a year and a half ago, and every country around Iran hates Iran. So it's not just us, to be honest, or this country.
Well, least of that is us.
Yeah.
That would be the least of their problems.
Iranian people, they'll be like, man, they're so grumpy and rude.
Well, this is well out of the scope of this class to discuss the political issues of that whole region. But I don't think it's the United States in this case. There are certain countries you can just kind of write off and say there's no way these countries will be messing with Iran. Okay, very good. That's a good article. Did you guys also have you guys heard about Twitter? In the context of security,
Oh yeah.
you guys haven't heard?
They got hacked.
See, so after all, I have not been living under the rock. Okay, so I'm just focusing on stuff that are closer, right? Twitter, I think they call that a worm, I think that's it, Twitter worm. And there was a that was a picture that was really appropriate. Yeah, this is it.
Oh,
Yeah, Twitter with a worm, Yeah, it's very funny. But this one, okay, you guys already know what Twitter is, right? It's a way to send messages to people who subscribe to your tweet. Is that how they call it? That's how it's called. So this is a perfect mechanism to push viruses out, to push malware. Now, but for the most part, you would ask, but how are you going to push something that's nasty out? Because how do you tweet? You have a text HTML editor, right? So for the most part, you would say, well, we can only push HTML stuff, just like